Hello, everybody. We're back with another episode here on Inside Whitehall with me, Jonathan Gullis.
And me, James Starkey.
Well, it's great to have you back and great to be talking. We are currently in parliamentary recess, so all the drama that's been going on is hopefully going to subside whilst party leaders are out and about over the East holidays, knocking up doors and setting expectations ahead of those important local and devolved elections on the 7th of May 2026. Now, James, we're seeing a lot of stuff about opinion polls. We see sort of some pollsters now saying Greens, Tories, and Labour are kind of duking out around 18% on average. Reform currently around the 25, 26% mark, down from their sort of 32, 33%, I think, which was in around September of 2025. Expectation management is going to be important for Reform UK. I think they would have seen the FT article that was recently done where it said they were going to gain 2,200 councillors and be quite concerned about that because that seems to be setting a very high bar. And if obviously Kemi is looking for a fight back, will she get the story of London, regaining Wandsworth, Kensington and Chelsea? And of course, Keir Starmer, well, let's be frank, is fighting for his political survival and was in Wolverhampton as we record today, saying that there's lots of energy in the room. And he obviously believes, obviously, he would have to say that. At the same time, we're hearing that Sadiq Khan might be made a peer of the realm and join the cabinet after the local election. So, first of all, James, expectation management. Form UK is still leading in polls now, over 250 opinion polls. What do you think good looks for them? Is there a huge amount of pressure for them to do well?
Well, I think so. From a comms perspective, purely, I think expectation management really hard for everyone, almost apart from the Labour Party. So, politically, it's probably going to be most damaging for the Labour Party, and in particular, Keir Starmer. It will lead to renewed discussion about his leadership. I think me and you have wavered a little bit, but I personally probably back on the train that we end the year with Keir Starmer as leader. Although I think the kind of Burnham episode and some of the stuff over the past month gave us a reason to wobble, and that can obviously come back. But I think aside whether he stays or goes, I think the election results, what we see in London and in Wales, probably in particular, those two places in particular, but the overall probably bad results for Labour, will lead to new calls for Starmer to go and kind of a new direction and a reset and all the kind of same old, nonsense, let's say, that we get with all these things time after time after time that me and you have seen lots of times before. But in a way, from a comms perspective, that's then easier to deal with. If you're the director of communications for the Labour Party or the Prime Minister, you just need to rock bottom it, really. I think other than worrying about saying it's going to be, the PM cannot go out and say it's going to be disastrous because that'll probably push him over the edge. He needs to talk it up. Everyone kind of knows that. But all the briefing, I bet, coming out of Number 10 and Labour Party HQ will probably be, look, it's midterms, it's always going to be difficult, there's a war on, etc., etc. Every excuse under the sun to lower expectations for Labour. So, and I think you might look at that and think, oh, that's tricky, but I think comms-wise it's just easier. It's a single message, it's a simple message, and it's a believable message because most people think Labour are going to get their backside handed to them across different parts of the country. I think it gets more complex for the Tories and more complex for Reform in a way. And I think actually the people who I think it's going to be trickiest for is someone we don't mention so much, and that's probably why it's going to be tricky for them, is the Liberal Democrats. Because I think, we could probably get to them in a second, but to answer your point, I think Reform, it's tricky, to my mind, because in a way I think they themselves have hyped up, well now you, have hyped up this election. And we've seen this talk of 2,000 seats in the FT, which they really should be trying to talk down a bit more, I think. I think they probably won't make as big a gains in London as it maybe looked 6 months ago. My personal opinion, as I said to you repeatedly, is I think it's all fine for Reform because I think the shock of seeing them become such significant parties in both Wales and Scotland, I think that'll be the story for reform. I think even if there will be commentary around London, and that will lead to, I think, two particular issues for reform in the longer term, which is Farage too Marmite? Does he put off too many people? Do you get coalitions of groups like we saw in Gorton voting against Farage rather than for someone else? And the geographical spread, can they win across the country? So can reform really take the battle to the Conservative Party in the shires and London? And this might be seen as a bit of a test for that. But overall, I think people will focus on Wales and Scotland. But I'm kind of interested in your take on the party that we don't talk about too much, the clown that is Ed Davey. I think there's growing whisperings. I spoke to someone from the Lib Dems, and me and you both spoke to someone who had heard whispers about there's maybe some movement against Ed Davey. There's definitely sounds like there are whisperings, because me and you had a chat with someone who said this. I said it to a Lib Dem friend of mine, and they said, "Oh, it's absolutely true," which is that people outside outside of the Ed Davey faithful are starting to ask questions about why they're not cutting through so much. Why Zach Polanski's taking all the limelight? Why, with Nigel Farage roaming around, which should be a great bogeyman for Lib Dem sympathetic voters, are they not making more inroads? And there's whispers of people like Christine Jardine who might be quite interested in that job. I think they do have two or three fairly decent people that probably potentially could, viably do that job. So I think their expectation management's interesting, because if they're not seen to have a good locals, I think that will really kick some questions up for Davey.
Well, look, I think with the Liberal Democrats, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because first of all, they were probably the second best winners from last year's set of local elections. They made continued inroads. I think they have the second biggest net gains after Reform UK. So there was a real positive.
I mean, me and you kind of
literally a year after becoming the third largest party in Parliament, 72 MPs. I think the largest for decades, if I remember correctly, in terms of
post-tuition lie. They kind of famously went into coalition with the Tories, promised Nick Clegg, if anyone remembers him, he sold his soul and went off to the States. He's back now. Famously, great video circulating one today saying, well, we shouldn't back nuclear because it wouldn't be here at the earliest of 2023, which is crazy. Of course he was right about that. Remember when everyone agreed with Nick? Well, not anymore. It took them, a decade close, really? 8 years to recover from that. But this is supposed to be their comeback now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's interesting for them, because there are elections in London where, like you say, you would expect Lib Dems to be the beneficiaries of Labour's demise. Actually, now it looks like that'll be the Green Party. There'll be local elections in other parts of the country. For example, the Sussex area, you'd think Lib Dems maybe could have some inroads there. Maybe even in places like sort of Hampshire way, where again, I think the Lib Dems have got some councils that they control, or certainly are larger groups. And they think they should be doing quite well there. And ultimately, the polling is not looking pretty. The people have literally forgotten. When everyone talks about multi-party politics, they seem to mention Reform, Labour, Conservative and Greens. And the Lib Dems are kind of an afterthought that sort of almost mistakenly seem to get mentioned. And I think that...
Why do you think that is?
I think that is simply the case that Ed Davey was a beneficiary in that last general election of anyone but the Conservatives. I think we saw a large coalition on the left to learn to tactically vote. So in certain areas, they knew to vote Labour to get rid of the Conservatives. In others, they knew to vote Lib Dem. And they saw that played out in by-elections where, Tory majorities of 20,000 plus were being overturned either by Labour or Lib Dem. So we've seen that play out. But I think the problem is now...
Let me challenge you, because I think there's something more to it. Traditionally, this is what the Lib Dems have done. They've gone in and they've got a hold, and then they built on it. So my challenge to you would be, having an election where you're a gateway, right? That's what you need for a breakthrough. And they were probably going to need something where they, after the tuition fees, joking aside, I mean, it did cost them a lot of votes, probably was the thing that really damaged them. They needed a way back in. In a way, you could say Reform were the same boat. Reform were a protest vote at the last election. But Reform have built on that. They've kind of built a stable. They obviously went up to the 30s, and maybe you kind of around the mid to late 20s at the moment. But by and large, I think it would be hard to argue that Reform haven't built on the 24 election results. So it's not, and you've jettisoned your manifesto from that. So that's not an attack. That's clearly a comment on. It's clearly possible to take a vote that was kind of lent to you, if you like, in protest, and then grow that. Why hasn't Ed Davey done that?
Because I think Ed Davey initially planned to kind of play Mr. Nice Guy to Keir Starmer. You see in PMQs all the time, and therefore failed to ever grasp the nettle on any serious issues. Almost himself was silent. There was that period where the Conservative Party was going through the leadership contest. Reform UK were kind of figuring out what's the next steps in terms of professionalisation. There was a big opportunity when it came to winter fuel, family farm tax. Again, Lib Dems represent a lot of rural communities now. Stratford-on-Avon, where I'm from, right? Lib Dem MP, Lib Dem run district council. That should have been a flagship area for them. And yes, they did make gains in that area in the last set of local elections. But again, it was more, still just a carrying on of the protest vote. And actually, the momentum seems to very clearly to me have stalled, and they're not aligned with any particular issue. Whereas in Reform UK are aligned very much on immigration. They're obviously now trying to enter the economy space. They've obviously done a lot on law and order in London, in particular for Laila Cunningham there. The Conservative Party is putting a lot of emphasis on the economy and cost of living. And so I just think that Lib Dems have got caught out trying to basically just look cuddly and nice. Whereas in Zach Polanski has gone, you know what? Labour's betrayed its traditional left-wing voter base. They've told the Corbynistas they're not welcome. I'm going to plant my flag firmly in the socialist space. I'm going to be the party for those disillusioned with capitalism because they haven't been the beneficiaries of it, or they think it doesn't work in their favour. They think there's loads of elites who basically everyone panders to. Labour accepting donations from multi-millionaire and billionaires, etc., etc. I'm going to fill that void. And Zach Polanski is charismatic, whatever people think of him. He's engaging. And I think he's also learned to message something in a way that does resonate with the voter base. I watch their videos and I think that, they feel human, they connect, you understand the message. Whereas in Ed Davey just talks all the time about Nigel Farage being Trump's poodle, which I just think might have worked as a gimmick in 2024, but it's just not cutting through anywhere near like it once did.
It also, because your point on how they treat Starmer, within, I can't remember when it was first kind of 6 months, definitely inside the first year after the election, so late 24, early 25. I was at an event in Parliament, and we were talking for another a campaign I'm involved in. We were talking to a couple of Green MPs about where they might be on certain issues. And one of them said, openly, and this was agreed by the other Greens that were there, is we don't see our job as opposing the Labour government. We're there to support them. And I remember...
You mean Lib Dems, by the way, James? You said Greens. You mean Lib Dems, sorry.
Lib Dems, you're right.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Get easily confused, some will say. And, and I think it really stuck with me because I thought, I get it that there's probably areas where any opposition, even if you're the Conservatives and even if you're Reform, that you tactically support the government of the day on, because it would just look like playing politics if you don't. And probably part of that is because you basically just agree with them on this issue. So why have a fight for the sake of it? So that's fine, but the way they said, they don't see it as their job to oppose the government, they see it as to support them. I was like, this seems very, very dangerous to me, because if you don't define yourself at the next election, then you're praying for a protest vote, i.e., if I like Labour, I'm just going to vote for the real thing. And if I don't, well, I'm not going to vote for you because you've done everything they've said. I mean, to me, it seems like a way, to me, it seems like where Davies ended up, which is, what are the Lib Dems? What's their purpose? They don't oppose the government. They don't have any new ideas. I think Davies done some half-decent stuff around social care. He's at least kept the issue alive. Most main parties are trying to pretend it doesn't exist. So fair play to Ed Davey on that one thing. But outside of that, they don't really have any policy other than just attacking Trump, who, the last time I checked, Trump wasn't in power in the United Kingdom. So... And also, by the way, crucially, let's just remind ourselves again, because people keep mentioning this with Trump and Farage. Trump won't be president when we have a general election. So
I was about to say the exact thing, James. I was about to say the exact thing. If this election happens in 2029, apologies for the stuttering there, Donald Trump won't be in office. The election will have happened. In fact, the inauguration will have also already taken place, there will be a new person in the White House, and so therefore the bogeyman the Lib Dems are desperate to create won't be on the ballot paper, to be perfectly frank. And so I find it sort of very particular, very odd, and I think that it'll be fascinating. Look, Lib Dems look like they'll hold Richmond on Thames, where obviously there's a strong base around there. But Camden, you'd think they should be making inroads there. It looks like the Greens. Some people even think the Greens could potentially take the council around there. Hackney, again, the Greens look like they're the ones who are having a fight with Labour for the mayoralty. It is truly amazing to watch this in action. Again, on that, if you look at that sort of where Richmond is, Ealing and stuff like that, should the Lib Dems be really making inroads there? They look like they won't. They look like they'll end up stalling at best. And so I think for all the talk about Keir Starmer's future, and I think Nigel Farage has said, look, these set of local elections are important for myself, for Kemi, and for Keir in different ways, in different guises. Actually, I think that Ed Davies should be added to that mix. I really do wonder, actually, ironically, is he now the leader most in danger of not seeing out the end of 2026 as the leader of his own party? I mean, the other thing I'm interested in, James, is that you say reform, obviously, look, will do good. I'm a big believer. A second place finish in Wales, a third place finish in Scotland, and 1,000 councillors to 1,500 councillors gained is still a monumental effort, and amazing, as you say, for a party that will then officially be in around 2,000 councillors nationwide. In total, that is a cemented. They're larger than the Greens. They'll be knocking on the Tories' door, to be frank. I'll be fascinated to see how Reform do in places like Norfolk and Suffolk. The expectation, and Essex, those will be areas that Reform are expected to do well. But do we see this Kemi bounce that's talked a lot about? Does we see the fight back in those traditional areas, West and East Sussex as well? But I'm interested, James, because there's a lot of talk about, obviously, the Conservatives. And there seems to be, it's interesting, there's expectation that in those areas I just named, Reform UK is going to come in and win big. But ironically, the Conservatives look like, within and around London, maybe in Bexley and Bromley, where Reform were targeting, do they actually, the Conservatives, do better than expected? But interestingly, do they make sufficient gains? Do they reclaim Wandsworth, which is one of the flagship councils for the Conservative Party previously? Do they regain Kensington and Chelsea? Do they regain the cities of London and Westminster? These would be, it would be a great story, I suspect, because it would then probably level out the playing field in terms of net gains and net losses, and probably, I'm assuming, cement Kemi's position as remaining as leader, no immediate threat to her leadership.
I think once Rob Jenrick was kicked out, not defected.
When he joined Reform UK, yes, when he joined Reform.
Not defected, as people like to say. When he was booted out, I think from the moment Jenrick left, Kemi was safe for quite a while. I think there's going to be little appetite to get rid of her. I think it's probably a combination of two things. Obviously, I think she was seen to have a decent conference and things have stabilised polling-wise, and her popularity's increased. So I think, big questions are, can she translate that into a polling increase over time? Let's see. But, I think she's seen as having done a decent job over the past now 6 to 8 months. And then with Rob gone, I think she's safe anyway. I think it would take something exceptional now for there to be serious calls for her to go. There doesn't feel, I've seen quite a few MPs recently, and I don't get anything close to a mood that they would move against her. So I think that's fine. I think in London it's interesting. You will know as well as I think you've got some quite solid constituencies, associations. Around those kind of donut area of London. So I think you probably still got a very strong group of activists and good solid data on which to campaign on.
Bob Blackman is a machine. I will say this. Bob, you want to see campaigning? Bob Blackman is an example.
MPs kind of around London, I think, and some strong associations as well. Maybe some that still, I think Theresa Villiers' old association, I think, it's still got decent numbers and still a kind of decent unit. And
yeah, Bexley, Bromley Way, they're strong, good money, a large amount of members. From what I can remember historically, I think that they've obviously got the incumbency with lots of councillors. That always helps, right? Because they are already ground troops just for the fact they're fighting for their own re-election.
The politics of London, which is maybe you've got that kind of tipping point. I think there's a lot of solid Conservative voters who aren't going to leave the party now, and I think with the kind of almost the Greens and the prospect of Khan in the future, as Khan suggested he probably will run again. and those kinds of things. I think it will help Tory turnout. I think those things never hurt Tory turnout, and perhaps the chaos around later. So I think it's kind of probably a mix of things that are helping the Tories around London.
Out of interest, James, because we've obviously got the James Hill and Tim Shipman did a piece in The Spectator where they said that Reform UK is going to start pivoting its messaging in Wales to now say vote Reform to stop Plaid. Obviously, Plaid's now been leading most of the opinion polls, suggested they'll be largest party with Reform, just behind in second place.
Mm.
The hope and expectation is that that will squeeze the Conservative vote. And there was one MRP by YouGov that suggested that the Conservatives are currently on around 9%, which would leave them just one MS for the entirety of Wales. And the hope is a bit like what Plaid did in the Caerphilly by-election with the Labour vote. Reform can do the same. And the reason that's interesting is there's a belief internally in Reform that as long as they're ahead of the Conservatives come a general election, it looks like the only two who could get into Downing Street is Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage. That there'll be lots of Tories who will lend their vote to Reform in order to stop a left-wing coalition or to stop Keir Starmer. How much are you buying that out of interest? Because I think there was some polling that suggested tactical voting is not necessarily as favourable on the centre-right of British politics as it is on the centre-left.
I think it's early days. I mean, look, I think one, I would say, is the tactic working in Wales? Maybe it's working in Wales, but you and I both know the nature of the Welsh voting system is very different than the rest of the United Kingdom. So I'm not sure that the results are too replicable across the rest of the country. I think, and Wales is quite different politics. It's got a very concentrated centre right vote geographically, and so there's different things at play there. I suspect that's not to say it's totally irrelevant, and I think it's right of Reform or any party to be testing out messaging in these kinds of elections that they might then, but they'll then look at the success or otherwise of and deploy in a general. That's a very sensible thing to do. So if they, if you guys, if they think that works, they might try that. I think in a general, well, look, I think the problem with that, maybe this is wishful thinking for me, but the problem for that is, I think if Reform are going to the election on kind of 34%, then maybe you can make that argument. I think if you're mid-20s, then it's a harder argument to make because you're not on track for a majority. And so I think where you might have specific constituencies where that makes sense, well, the counter view will obviously make sense as well. I mean, if you want to go by that logic, then there'll be sitting Conservative MPs and even new challenging ones where Reform can't win, and we go back to maybe the geographical and the London divide, where if you're going to deploy that argument, it's kind of hard to counter someone saying, well, if I'm on the outskirts of London, I've got to vote Conservative because Reform can't win it. So I think, could it work? It could do. I think you'll know better than me. Like, I suppose there's one thing running a local election campaign on that. So, whoever runs in your former seat of Stoke-on-Trent North, I think, that it might make sense there. Let's see what happens in your local elections and so on. But I think by the time we get to the next general election, it might make sense where, if you look at the last election, me and you have talked about this more than once, let's say, off air. If you look at the last election, if you had run for Reform, probably you'd won that seat. I think that's not your words, that's my view. And so that would make sense for someone to say you've got to pick one of these to tactical vote. But the question, me and you both know, if you run a national campaign on that, that's got other wider connotations. And I think one of the connotations, if you're not anywhere over 30%, will be, well, surely you're going to tell Tories to vote for, you're surely going to tell Reform voters to vote for Tories in areas they can't win. And then you get into a whole cycle of things. So,
well, it leads us nicely on, James, to the next topic we want to discuss, which is obviously a book that you've been reading, looking at the Canada situation where the Reform and the Conservative Party after nearly a decade, or over a decade, the two essentially finally merged. And to put that into context, on Sky they ran a piece, the Fight for the Right, where Beth Rigby had got some polling commissions, and it said that, for example, at the moment, only 1 in 4 Reform and Conservative, I think, members or voters combined were open to any kind of deal, which is well below, I think, almost two-thirds on the progressive left, Greens, Lib Dems, and Labour, who are more willing to do that. So there's that issue there. Then there was the fact that currently, on current polling, and appreciate we are a long way from general election, current polling would suggest there's 313 parliamentary seats that Reform UK are the best option to defeat the incumbent. There's 93 where the Conservatives are the best option, just off the raw current data that we have. And so essentially, there is that chat where Beth Rigby saying to people, will you do a deal? And obviously, at the moment, we're getting from either side very clearly, no, no, no. And I'm intrigued, James, to see what's the lesson from the book. I'll let you plug the book. I think it's well worth reading, but also you've written about it on Substack too. But what were the lessons you took away about the journey that some people wonder, will that be replicated in this country? Will Conservative and Reform finally merge? Or are they destined to fight to the death and only one will survive?
Yeah, so I guess it's probably worth saying, firstly, unfortunately, it's not my book. I really enjoyed the book, and I think it's out a few years ago. But just some background as to kind of why I was interested. Maybe not, I think, being honest, and not in the last kind of 6 months or so, but I think certainly in the year after the election, particularly from kind of reform-leaning people, whether they were in reform or not, quite a few people started talking about Canada to me and were saying, oh, this is what happened in Canada. There was a reform Canada. And I had various descriptions of how this went, about Canadian politics, which I must profess I knew very little, if anything, about. I knew about Trudeau, Carney obviously won recently, but nothing about the history, and certainly the history of the Canadian kind of centre-right, if you like. And so I think when I looked at the polling, I think you can see, especially as Reform came kind of steady, like is now tracking below 30. Maybe it'll go up again. I'm not someone who thinks there's a definitive ceiling, but I looked at the polling, and one of the things that is obvious from it is at the moment there are some MRP polls, but on a lot of polls, if you really look at it at face value, it points to neither the Conservatives nor Reform being able to obtain a majority as things stand. And I think if you do a straw poll of a lot of kind of middle ground people in Westminster, by middle ground I mean sensible rather than centre ground. Centre ground people I'm not sure always fit into the sensible category. But I think if you speak to kind of middle ground people, then I think you would say a lot of people at the moment would probably, if they had to put their £100 somewhere, whatever they wanted to bet, or but let's not encourage betting in Westminster, but if people that are allowed to, then it would probably be on a kind of left wing coalition. But it could easily be on a right-wing coalition. And so I was curious, like, how relevant was this Canadian, this Canadian Reform Party and joining and so on. And in a nutshell, I won't go into all the nooks and details. And I've written a piece on my Substack, and the book's name on there. I'll get the full book title and get it wrong. It's called Full Circle, Death and Resurrection in Canadian Conservative Politics by Bob Plamondon. And it kind of takes you through a good potted history of the right overall, as well as the rise of Reform, and then crucially what happened. I'll give you a very brief synopsis. Reform Party. So the Conservatives are in a rare period of government. They're not the natural party of government as they are in this country. That's the Liberals, really, who's run currently Mark Carney, and a bit more like the Labour Party, but much more pragmatic than the UK Labour Party, I would say. And so the Conservatives are not massive in power loads, but Brian Mulroney is the progressive Conservatives, as they're called, Prime Minister in the late 80s. And there's a frustration on the Canadian right that while Thatcher is, running sweeping economic reforms in the United Kingdom, and Reagan is doing much the similar in America, and they're seeing economic booms as a result of this, there's a frustration in Canada that they're not doing that. And I think if you speak to people, Mulroney probably did quite a few good things, but he didn't bring down the deficit, and he wasn't seen to embrace this kind of liberal economics that was going on in it was very big at the time amongst the right of politics in Western democracies. And so that frustration really leads to this party called Reform. And they basically, come out of nowhere in the 93 election, I think it is, and the Tories go from being in government to having 2 MPs, which leads to, and this is not my joke, this is a joke that's in the book, someone joking that one of the MPs, their wife is sleeping with half the Parliamentary Conservative Party because her husband is half of the party. And that's kind of maybe a sign of where the Tories were at that point. They were a bit of a joke, that is some collapse. And this is a kind of, I think, apocryphal story told about Conservative parties and was told about the British Conservative Party, how easily you can collapse. I think a couple of things to mention. One, very different party. So the Canadian Conservative Party didn't have the same history of being in government as the British Conservative Party. And so I don't think had the level of those kind of roots and so on and ability to maybe to bounce back that I think the Conservative Party potentially does have. Also, people champion this rise of reform. The Reform Party, or the Alliance as it became called just after reform and before the parties merged, never got into government. So a reform leader was never prime minister. And they started off with a quite populist leader. And it was only when Stephen Harper became leader and they joined that they won elections. And I would say a lot of that is not down to the party, it's down to Stephen Harper. He's quite an exceptional figure from what I can tell. Very, very smart guy. Interestingly, although he kind of ends up on the Reform Alliance side of things, really a kind of true blue. I think, read about him. I don't know him. I got put in touch with a couple of people that have worked for him or met him in the past couple of months. But I think a guy who knows his own mind, I think would be the polite way of saying it, but a very, very smart guy, very clear-eyed guy, very good politician, and went on to lead Canada for quite some years when he came into power. So I think the interesting things about it for me are, while divided, the right didn't win. Reform did come from nowhere and did establish itself as a viable, ongoing political party. It did not disappear. It did not blow up, as some people say that will happen to Reform here. It didn't go up in a puff of smoke after a while. It stuck around, and by and large, when it came in, it did do better than the Progressive Conservatives until they merged. But the flip side is, even the Progressive Conservatives in Canada, which hadn't been historically successful, they didn't die out either. And I don't think they would have done if they hadn't have merged. I think they merged because both realised neither was going to get a majority on its own. And so I think that there's differences. They came in not off the back of immigration. The Liberal Party are a different beast to fight. I think there's a lot of geographical politics in Canada you have to deal with, and Liberals have been very good at that historically. There's clear differences. So it doesn't mean Reform over here can never get a majority. Or the Conservatives can't get rid of Reform. I wouldn't say that, but I would say there's some definite things to think about there. To me, which is it's perhaps a bit more complicated than people said. And the two last things I'll say is, one, I think it reminds you that personalities are crucial in politics. So this guy Manning, like Farage, I don't think a new party would have started without him and done as well as it was, and the same as Nigel Farage. People think it's easy. I don't think it is. I don't think unless the two parties had the leaders they did at the time to come together, they would have come together. I.e., even if one of the leaders doesn't want to come together, that's not going to happen. And then it took someone like Stephen Harper, who was quite an exceptional politician, to get back in and led Alliance, but really, I think, fundamentally was a Tory. And events. People would say their Tories are about to be wiped out. They wouldn't be wiped out in an election. That would actually give them an inordinate boost, even though they'd really done quite badly. But the fact they were still going on 12 or 15% after various elections meant people were like, oh, well, they're not going anywhere. So I think we've got a lot of events to happen, and we've definitely got a lot of personalities. So I think calling what happens is very difficult.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean,
but maybe you disagree with
really
some of that, or do you think you can't learn lessons from this, or?
No, I think number one, there's always lessons to be learned. But I agree with you that it's an interesting dynamic because the centre right of Canada is not the natural party of government. It is not used to opposition, unlike in this country here. And I think that the other difference is obviously in Canada, there kind of was for a long time and still is now only two options, like again we had in this country, whereas in Now, as we've seen with multi-party politics, in this country, maybe you can get away with probably maybe we'll see 28%, maybe 28% and 30%. Maybe that will be enough to get someone a majority just under the current system. Unlikely, but that maybe we see that, and that I think would be quite a jaw-dropping moment because well, what does that mean for our electoral system? And of course, as you've always said, there's very different kind of demographics in certain areas. Maybe it's more concentrated in certain areas of Canada, whereas it is not so much here in the UK. Or indeed, obviously, with the UK, we've got the Plaid in Wales, you've got the SNP in Scotland. That has huge implications for particularly Labour at the moment. It certainly had implications for the Conservatives historically as well, in terms of needing to win bigger in England to make up for those other areas. So I think it's going to be quite interesting. I think the Bernard Manning, what's quite interesting is there does seem to be a similarity with some of the personalities. Manning, in terms of being around for a long time, had always been quite outspoken, had been very consistent in terms of their views. I think there is a lot of correlation with Nigel Farage in terms of that longevity in British politics and having that name essentially. And look, I think anyone would be daft to think that Reform UK would be where it is if it wasn't for Nigel Farage. That doesn't go against Richard Tice, who I think did a very admirable and hard and diligent job to keep that party going by himself. And actually, ironically, he almost did what the Progressive Conservatives did, right? He was polling around 1-2%. He was funding a lot of his own money, Richard Tice, into Reform UK to make sure it was around. And obviously got it to around 12-13% before Nigel came back in right at the general election where they got up to the 15% mark. So I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned. I think ultimately we will a lot. I think I've always come to the view that a lot will always depend on what happens at after the next general election. What's the state of play after the next general election? There will inevitably be people who will put pressure for a deal beforehand. Reform UK, I think Luke Trill said this on the Future of the Right Sky interview, that it would cost both Conservative and Reform a lot of votes to even enter a deal or a formal pact because there's no appetite for it within their voter bases. And ultimately, there's a big sense of betrayal. I'm sure on both sides, I feel betrayed by the Conservatives. I'm sure Conservatives feel betrayed by people like me going to Reform. So, ultimately, I think that any idea of a pact or a deal is just is people who are dreaming and not based in any form of reality. I think after next general election, as we've said before, what happens? Do you see a progressive coalition? And if that's the case, do the donors, the money men for both parties end up exerting a lot of pressure on Reform and the Conservatives? Do we see a leadership contest within the Conservatives and maybe someone who's more open to doing a deal and is willing to sort of step aside and let Nigel be leader of whatever comes together?
Because also there'll be some that will call for a leadership election immediately because it's a new party. And why wouldn't you have? And that you get to things like whose constitution does it adopt? My knowledge is that in Canada, they actually, although kind of the narrative is it's kind of Reform takeover, it's not really true, in my opinion. And that's, I'm not an expert on it. I've read a book and I've spoken to a couple of people that work on the right or have worked on the right of the Conservative politics. But I think the alliance as Reform adopted the Progressive Conservatives' broad, constitution, and Harper, who led them, he was an alliance Reform guy. He was a bit. I hope he doesn't mind me saying it, he was a bit more like a Danny Kruger, in that he was undoubtedly a conservative, but probably felt the Canadian Conservatives weren't very conservative, which and I paraphrase, but I think it's what Danny kind of said when he left.
Yeah, and Danny said, James, just so you know, Danny's words were, "I haven't left the Conservative Party; the Conservative Party left me."
Yeah, and I think this is all delicate stuff because people will have different views on it. I think Danny is not a populist, in my opinion. Danny is a conservative who's decided to go to Reform. Harper's a bit more like that, So that's the guy that ended up leading them. And I think before, when Joe Clark, who'd been leader before, I don't know if he was an amazing leader, but I'm sure a decent guy, when he was leader of Progressive Conservatives, one of the things they couldn't agree on is, I can't remember who the leader was of the alliance then, but, neither wanted to step down as leader. And so, and then also you have the who wins a leadership debate, because let's not forget, I don't think it's going to happen anytime in the foreseeable for the exact reasons you say. I know people who would leave the Conservative Party tomorrow morning if it were to be announced.
And vice versa. I know people in Reform who would also walk out as well.
Some of those people are MPs, But as a thought experiment, you've got your membership. Farage probably will win your membership, but then you've got the Conservative membership, which we don't exactly know the makeup. I don't think, obviously, there's a size difference, but you'll have, if you have a leadership election, by definition, you don't know exactly which way it's going to go. So that's a reason why someone might say, well, if we join, we'll have a leadership election. That can blow a whole deal up. So that's how hard it will be to do. I don't think anything happens for the next election at all. Maybe some people do minor deals locally. That's as far as I can see it.
To make my position clear, James, we're here in Reform to replace the Conservative Party. I'm sure you'll have your say, but that's very much our intention and my intention when it comes to the next general election. You're going nowhere. Well, there you go. There you go. We're locking horns, butting heads. With no deal, no parlay over here. So we'll maybe it'll be. I mean, I feel like James fired the starting on Danny Kruger's future leadership contest, so I'm sure Danny will take that endorsement when it comes, and that support. But look, hopefully you've all been tuning in, listening. Obviously, look, we'll take a break for the rest of Easter recess, when we'll come back and see where things are with the war in Iran, what that means for energy bills, and what that means for prices at the pumps, and whether or not the government's going to put some sort of intervention in, whether or not John Healey's figured out how many naval frigates we now have after what was a bit of a car crash interview with Nick Ferrari, whether or not Angela Rayner's finally cleared of this HMRC investigation into stamp duty, whether Al Khan's has done another interview outlining himself to potentially be a future leader. The New Statesman seems to be inundated with potential leadership contenders doing an in-depth interview about their life and what brought them into politics.
The Spectator running regular op-eds from another cabinet minister.
Oh yeah, I was about to say they're sort of running. Ironically, there's another potential leadership contender using the Spectator as their base. I mean, it's quite interesting indeed. I'm not sure that will win the Labour faithful over, but it's an interesting tactic nonetheless. Maybe she's setting herself up for a future defection. Who knows? But we'll certainly see. I mean, again, fascinating, James. Just very quickly on that. Sadiq Khan is being talked about giving a peerage. We're now hearing Sadiq Khan may even well be put into a cabinet under Keir Starmer, returning Angela Rayner. We're even now hearing that there's discussion about whether or not to water down some of Shabana Mahmood's immigration rules. I mean, this is just the Prime Minister in fear of his own shadow, is it not? Or those that stood behind him, if this happens.
I mean, this is their day to day. I think they're living day to day. They're under this delusion that he's kind of semi-talking up the problems in Iran. And he's had some quote, I think, this morning saying, he's kind of more focused on that than anything else. I mean, as a British Prime Minister, you can have a limited impact on what happens, internationally. I mean, that's not even to say, we're Britain, we can't do anything anymore. It's not that. It's just obviously a huge geopolitical issue. But two, I would say, people can complain when Tories say this. The Conservatives had to deal with COVID. Virtually no, I think, democratic government that dealt with COVID stayed in afterwards. A kind of generational defining things that, mine and your kids that went through it, and teenagers and people going through university at that time, I think particularly impacted people, particularly below 30, really, or in certain types of jobs. They will never forget that for the rest of their lives. That was seismic, and the Ukraine war and the energy shock that caused. Well, the public, and it's their right to do so, they got to the next election. They didn't really take into account any of that. They voted the Tories out in their droves. And, you can do the blame game, but I think history would suggest you're not going to be... They're not. And in 3 years' time in the next election, if people are paying more for fuel and more for their mortgage, they're not going to care that him and Jonathan Powell had a conference with NATO in Geneva. And maybe or maybe not help draft the wording to a communique. It's just totally for the birds. My thing, honestly, if Cameron was sensible, he'd find a heavyweight. He could do worse than just going to Lord David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, and say, you be my foreign secretary, you work with Jonathan Powell, you both got loads of experience, I'm going to focus on these domestic issues. Keep on top of what's going on, but you can send a big gun around the world to go to some of these things, because I just think, I don't mean to rant about it, but you know this. You've been a minister. You've been an MP. There's one of you. There's one prime minister. You've got a certain amount of bandwidth. How are you going to spend the 24 hours of your day? And if you spend it on something, you're not spending it on something else. And the something that he needs to spend it on is growing the economy, cost of living, immigration, and the NHS. He needs to help Wes get what he needs to do. He needs to help Shabana get what she needs to do. And he needs to help Rachel get what she needs to do across government and get government working. And all the time he spends on a plane going to a different country is less time doing that. That's my rant over. Sorry, Jonathan.
No, I agree. Look, I agree with you. The idea of this whole always having a good war, and now he's making a big virtue of the fact that I'm not going to be bullied by Trump into a war. Well, how's bashing Trump going with Ed Davey and current polling?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, okay, it might play to a bit of your base that's looking at the Green Party, but your biggest issue is the Green Party just demonstrated they can win a parliamentary by-election in a 13,000 Labour seat majority, which is, by the way, not too dissimilar to the majority that Sir Keir Starmer himself has in his own seat. So the truth of the matter is, Camden, where the Prime Minister actually has his parliamentary seat, could well elect a lot of Green councillors, which means that we could be talking about whether Keir Starmer could even hold his own seat, and let alone Wes Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, who are going to see elections in their areas, in London and Birmingham too, and what that could
David
mean
Lammy,
for the future of their seats. David Lammy,
Stella
another
Creasy,
one that will be targeted.
prominent
I think
MP.
Bridget Phillipson up in
Yvette-
Sunderland.
Yvette will be in
With
trouble, yeah.
Bridget Phillipson up in Sunderland, we're talking about Labour losing every single ward in Sunderland. I mean, this is end of day stuff. And the idea of bringing Sadiq Khan, let's be frank, the moment Sadiq Khan gets into this cabinet, and even Angela Rayner, the reality is Ed Miliband's basically running the government in all but name at this stage, because he'll be sitting there quite happy thinking that he will be the kingmaker. If there is a leadership contest, Ed Miliband will either be the guy who gets to choose whether to run and probably win the leadership contest, or he'll be the one that anoints the winner and therefore gets to be the chancellor. And I think that is very much now the story that should be written. Is Ed Miliband is the future kingmaker if there is a leadership contest in the future.
Yeah, I think it's probably true. And as you alluded to, this is the kind of continual drift left of the Labour Party. Honestly, the drifting of the left, it's not even essentially the worst thing. It's a lack of knowing where you're going. I think if they came in on a clearer left platform or even pivoted earlier, but they had a kind of whole vision, at the moment, Khan, like Miliband is doing on certain issues, but Khan will be this times 10. It's just going to force them to do things they're not planning to do. And any of those things that cost money is just going to make Rachel Reeves's job a lot harder. We saw it on the welfare cuts. You know, they had to change their entire budget because they couldn't control
On the floor of the House.
Because they couldn't control
On the floor of the House.
yeah, because they can. He doesn't. He's not in power. You know, the Keir Starmer is basically now run by his backbenchers, and Ed Miliband, and it looks like he's soon to be run by Sadiq Khan, and that is not going to end well for the Labour Party.
I think we can all accept, James, Sadiq Khan in cabinet, Sadiq Khan literally last week said it's time for not just rejoin the customs union. He's now said it's time for Labour to say that the next election they will join the EU.
Oh yeah.
This is what you're inviting into the cabinet if you put Sadiq Khan in it.
Yeah, I think it would just look like chaos as well.
Well, if you love chaos, keep tuning in and we'll keep discussing it. And we'll find out if our predictions are right or wrong. I'm like James, I'm back with the Keir Starmer survives, but I'm sure that in 2 weeks' time we might pivot again, gone with whatever happens, because it just feels so unpredictable. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Read James's Substack about Panda. He's actually put a link as well to the book. You should definitely give it a read. I'm starting to read it too, because I think it's important to understand these monumental moments in history if you're a Politico like us and want to understand the differences. And we look forward to seeing you after the Easter break and seeing what else is going on, both here in Britain and the world. Take care, everybody.
Take care.